Jimin, don't say another word. Suga's voice trembled just enough for millions watching the live broadcast to notice. The studio, only seconds earlier filled with laughter, fell into an uneasy silence. Jimin lowered his eyes before quietly replying, "Hyung, if I stay silent today, I'll regret it for the rest of my life." The camera caught Jungkook staring in disbelief while RM instinctively leaned forward, sensing something had shifted beyond the planned interview. Then Jimin spoke one sentence that no producer had prepared for. Suga's expression emptied. His hands began to shake. Seconds later, he collapsed in front of the live audience. But what were the words powerful enough to break the composure of the member known for hiding every emotion behind a calm smile? And if you had been sitting in that studio, would you have believed Jimin had gone too far, or that he had just saved someone's life? Tell us your thoughts before the story unfolds. The red recording light above camera 3 had been glowing for almost 20 minutes, bathing the television studio in a warm crimson hue that contrasted with the cool white spotlights suspended overhead. Outside the massive soundstage, an autumn drizzle softened the city skyline, leaving faint streaks across the glass walls that overlooked Seoul. Inside, however, everything had been meticulously choreographed. Every chair had been measured, every camera angle rehearsed, every cue card approved days before the broadcast. The special live program had been organized to celebrate another meaningful milestone in BTS's journey, bringing the members together for an evening of memories, laughter, and honest conversations with fans around the world. It was designed to feel intimate despite the millions of viewers watching in real time. The audience inside the studio reflected that purpose. Rather than celebrities filling every seat, producers had invited ordinary people, longtime army members, young musicians, volunteers, families, and several guests whose personal stories had quietly inspired communities across South Korea. Their applause carried warmth instead of spectacle, creating an atmosphere closer to a heartfelt reunion than a television production. Jimin arrived earlier than everyone else that afternoon. Dressed simply in a charcoal jacket and black trousers, he greeted every camera operator, lighting technician, makeup artist, and security guard with the same gentle smile that had become second nature over years of standing under relentless public attention. Yet behind that familiar smile rested an unusual stillness. More than once, members of the backstage crew noticed him standing alone near a hallway window, watching raindrops gather before sliding silently down the glass. He wasn't nervous. He was thinking. Suga arrived nearly 30 minutes later, carrying a notebook that looked worn from years of use. The corners had softened, and loose pages peeked between handwritten lyrics and unfinished melodies. He nodded politely to the staff before exchanging a quiet smile with Jimin. Nothing dramatic passed between them. No emotional embrace. No lengthy conversation. Just a brief glance that seemed to communicate years of shared experiences without requiring a single explanation. "Didn't sleep much?" Jimin asked softly. Suga chuckled. "You know me too well." "Still writing?" Jimin nodded toward the notebook. "Always. You'll never stop, will you?" Suga looked down at the notebook before answering almost absent-mindedly. "Some songs don't let you." Jimin smiled, though something in Suga's answer lingered in his thoughts longer than expected. Around them, the remaining members gradually filled the backstage lounge. Jean instantly broke the quiet by joking about the catered food disappearing before rehearsal even began. J-Hope laughed so loudly that several crew members turned around smiling. V wandered toward a piano placed near the rehearsal room and absent-mindedly played a few gentle chords while Jungkook tested a handheld microphone, pretending to interview anyone who happened to walk past. RM, ever observant, gathered everyone for one final rundown of the evening's schedule, reminding them that although the broadcast would be relaxed, it was still live television. "No matter what happens," RM said with a calm smile, "let's just be ourselves." Everyone agreed. None of them realized how prophetic those words would become. As rehearsals continued, producers reviewed each segment. There would be nostalgic stories, unseen rehearsal footage, fan questions submitted from around the world, and conversations reflecting on friendship, growth, and the unseen moments behind life on stage. One producer proudly commented that this would probably become one of the group's most heartfelt broadcasts ever. Nobody disagreed. Yet beneath the polished schedule, invisible threads were already pulling the evening toward an entirely different destination. Among the invited audience sat a quiet young woman in her late 20s named Han. Seo-yeon, an original fictional character created for this story. She clutched a folded envelope inside her coat pocket throughout rehearsals, touching it repeatedly as if reassuring herself it remained there. She had traveled hundreds of kilometers to attend the program after receiving an unexpected invitation from the production team. To everyone else, she appeared to be another grateful fan fortunate enough to witness the recording. No one noticed the exhaustion hidden behind her smile, nor the hesitation every time applause echoed through the studio. Jimin noticed her only briefly while greeting audience members before the cameras rolled. She bowed politely but avoided prolonged eye contact. It was such a small moment that almost anyone else would have forgotten it immediately. Jimin didn't. Something about the way she held that folded envelope, and the quiet sadness lingering behind her expression. The countdown echoed softly through the studio speakers. 10, 9, 8. Every technician moved with practiced precision. Camera operators adjusted their focus one final time, stage managers exchanged silent hand signals, and the host inhaled deeply before the red light above the main camera illuminated. Applause filled the room as the broadcast began, warm and genuine, exactly as the producers had imagined. The opening conversation flowed effortlessly. Jin teased Jungkook about arriving at rehearsals with headphones on and ignoring everyone until coffee appeared. J-Hope imitated one of RM's serious rehearsal speeches, earning laughter from both the audience and the staff behind the cameras. V quietly played along with every joke, occasionally adding a perfectly timed comment that made even Suga smile. It looked like another unforgettable BTS broadcast. Yet while everyone else relaxed into the rhythm of the program, Jimin found his attention drifting toward the third row of the audience. Han Seo-yeon applauded whenever everyone else did, but there was always a slight delay. Her smile appeared only after looking around to make sure others were smiling first. More than once, she reached into her coat pocket, gently touching the folded envelope before quickly pulling her hand away. It wasn't anxiety about meeting BTS. Jimin had met thousands of fans over the years. This was something heavier, something she was trying desperately to carry alone. During the first commercial break, although the live stream temporarily switched to sponsored content, the studio itself remained busy. Makeup artists hurried toward the stage, staff members adjusted microphones, and assistants placed fresh bottles of water beside every chair. Jimin quietly stepped away from the other members, pretending to stretch his legs near the audience seating. "Is everything okay?" he asked Seo-yeon with the same gentle tone he would use when speaking to an old friend. She looked startled before forcing a smile. "Yes, thank you. I'm just nervous." Jimin studied her face for only a second. It wasn't the answer that caught his attention. It was the way she avoided saying it. Before he could continue, a production assistant called everyone back into position. "We'll live again in 30 seconds. Jimin simply nodded. "I hope you enjoy today," he said before returning to his seat. Seo-yeon watched him walk away, her fingers tightening around the envelope until the paper bent beneath the pressure. Across the stage, Suga had noticed the brief interaction. He didn't ask about it. He simply watched Jimin's expression as cameras rolled once more. After years of creating music together, he had learned to recognize the smallest changes in Jimin's eyes. Something had unsettled him, and if Jimin couldn't let it go, there was usually a reason. As the interview continued, the host introduced a segment featuring letters submitted by fans around the world. Some were joyful, thanking BTS for unforgettable concerts. Others spoke about finding comfort during difficult years. The atmosphere gradually shifted from playful to reflective. One letter described a teenager overcoming loneliness after discovering BTS's music. Another came from a father who had learned to reconnect with his daughter by listening to the group's albums together during long drives. Each story reminded everyone in the studio that music often traveled further than its creators could ever witness. Then the host smiled toward the audience. "Tonight," she said, "we've also invited several guests whose stories were personally selected because they represent the many different lives touched by music." The camera slowly swept across the audience. It paused only briefly on Seo-yeon before moving on. She lowered her head almost immediately. No one watching would have thought anything unusual of it. But Jimin noticed. So did Suga. There was fear in her eyes, not the fear of speaking publicly, but the fear of someone running out of time. Backstage, one of the floor managers quietly approached another producer with a clipboard. "That guest in row 3. He whispered. She almost asked to leave before the show started. "Why?" She wouldn't say. "Did something happen?" The manager shook his head. She only kept asking whether the members would really have time to read one more letter if the schedule changed. The producer glanced at the rundown. Every minute of the broadcast had already been carefully planned. There wasn't supposed to be room for anything extra. "Let's stay on schedule," the producer replied. "We can't change the program now." Neither of them realized that the folded envelope resting inside Seo-yeon's pocket contained words she had rewritten dozens of times over the previous month. It was not a fan letter asking for an autograph. It was not a request for a photograph. It was a goodbye she had never intended to read aloud, written after receiving devastating news that had quietly.
The second half of the live broadcast settled into a quieter rhythm. The laughter that had filled the studio earlier gradually gave way to thoughtful conversation. The host invited the members to reflect on the moments the public had never seen, the nights when rehearsals stretched until sunrise, the long flights that blurred into one another, and the silent sacrifices hidden behind performances that always appeared effortless. Soft amber lights dimmed across the stage, replacing the brighter studio glow with a warmer atmosphere that resembled an intimate living room rather than a national television set. The audience leaned forward, listening not as spectators but as people sharing the same room. Suga rested one elbow on the arm of his chair, answering each question carefully, his voice calm and measured. "People often think music begins when we enter the studio," he said with a faint smile. "Sometimes it begins much earlier, in conversations we almost forget or in moments we wish we could forget." The audience responded with gentle applause. Jimin looked toward him for a brief moment, recognizing the familiar honesty hidden beneath those carefully chosen words. Years of friendship had taught him that Suga rarely spoke casually. Every sentence usually carried something unspoken beneath it. Meanwhile, Han Seo-yeon lowered her eyes again. She carefully unfolded the letter inside her coat pocket beneath the cover of her handbag, reading a few lines before quietly folding it once more. Her breathing had become noticeably uneven. The woman seated beside her, an elderly fan who had traveled from Busan with her granddaughter, noticed the trembling in Seo-yeon's hands. "Are you all right?" she whispered. Seo-yeon forced another smile. "Just a little emotional." It sounded convincing enough. Yet the older woman instinctively reached over and gently squeezed her hand before returning her attention to the stage. That simple act of kindness almost caused Seo-yeon's composure to break. Back on stage, the host introduced another segment featuring unseen rehearsal footage from previous tour. The large screen behind BTS, filled with images of exhausted members laughing between dance practices, helping one another memorize choreography, sharing meals late at night, and celebrating small victories that cameras rarely captured. The audience smiled, some wiping away quiet tears. J-Hope laughed as an old rehearsal clip showed him accidentally slipping during practice. Jungkook buried his face in embarrassment after another clip revealed him forgetting lyrics during an early recording session. Even Suga chuckled quietly at footage of himself falling asleep in a studio chair with headphones still on. The atmosphere softened again, yet Jimin's attention drifted once more toward row 3. Seo-yeon wasn't watching the screen anymore. Instead, she stared blankly at the folded envelope resting in her lap. She looked as though she were silently arguing with herself. Leave now or stay until the end. Her fingers tightened around the paper again. Across the studio, Suga followed Jimin's gaze. "Still thinking about her," he murmured during a brief pause while another video package played. Jimin answered without looking away. "Something feels wrong." Suga nodded almost imperceptibly. "I noticed. She keeps looking at that letter. Maybe she's deciding whether to give it to someone." Jimin remained silent for several seconds before quietly replying, "No, I think she's deciding whether anyone should read it at all." Suga didn't respond immediately. Instead, he observed Seo-yeon himself. Years spent writing songs about pain had given him an uncomfortable familiarity with expressions people tried hardest to hide. There was a difference between sadness and resignation. What he saw in her face unsettled him. During another scheduled break, producers hurried around preparing the next live segment. One assistant approached the host with updated cue cards, while another informed the members that they were slightly ahead of schedule. "We actually have about 4 extra minutes," the stage manager whispered. "Maybe we can take one more audience question." The producer hesitated. "Only if it's simple, we don't want to disrupt the flow." Unbeknownst to everyone except Seo-yeon, those 4 unexpected minutes would become the turning point of the entire evening. She slowly removed the envelope from her pocket and looked at the handwriting covering its front. The ink had faded slightly where tears had once fallen weeks earlier. She closed her eyes, inhaled deeply, then quietly stood from her seat. A nearby usher immediately approached. "Ma'am, do you need assistance?" she asked gently. Seo-yeon hesitated. "Could you please give this to one of the staff after the show?" The usher accepted the envelope politely without reading the name written on the front. Before she could step away, Jimin happened to glance toward the audience again. He saw the exchange. It lasted barely 3 seconds, yet something inside him shifted instantly. He leaned toward Suga, his voice almost inaudible beneath the applause beginning for the next segment. "Hae-young," he whispered. "I think we're about to lose someone." Suga slowly turned toward him, the warmth leaving his expression as he looked directly at the envelope disappearing into the hands of the usher. Neither of them knew what the letter contained. neither of them knew Seo-yeon's story. But for the first time that evening, both felt the same quiet fear settling over the studio, a feeling that whatever happened next would matter far beyond the cameras, beyond the broadcast, and perhaps beyond any song they had ever written. The floor manager raised 3 fingers from behind the main camera. 3 minutes remained before the program would move into its closing performance. Producers relaxed slightly, believing the broadcast had unfolded exactly as planned. The audience remained fully engaged, the members looked comfortable, and social media monitors backstage showed viewers praising the sincerity of the conversations. Everything suggested the evening would end as another memorable live special. But life rarely follows a rundown sheet. As the host glanced at the updated cue cards, she smiled. "We have a few unexpected minutes left," she announced. "Instead of moving on immediately, we'd love to hear from someone here in the audience. If anyone has a question or a story they'd like to share, this is your chance." A wireless microphone was handed to an assistant who began scanning the audience. Several fans smiled nervously. One young boy excitedly raised his hand. A middle-aged father encouraged his daughter to speak. Then almost instinctively, Jimin lifted his own hand slightly toward the assistant. "The woman in the third row," he said gently, "if she's comfortable." Every camera slowly turned toward Han Seo-yeon. She froze. Her eyes widened as if she had never expected to be noticed. The microphone stopped in front of her, but she couldn't bring herself to take it. "It's all right," the host said kindly. "There's no pressure." For several long seconds nobody spoke. Even the audience remained unusually still, sensing that something delicate was unfolding. Finally, Seo-yeon accepted the microphone with trembling hands. Her voice cracked before the first sentence could finish. She lowered her head, embarrassed. "I'm sorry," Jimin offered a reassuring smile. "You don't have to apologize." His words were simple, but they carried no expectation, only patience. Seo-yeon inhaled shakily. "I've listened to your music for almost 12 years, she began. "I practiced smiling because of your songs, even on days when smiling felt impossible." The audience listened in complete silence. "I told myself this would just be a thank you." Her fingers tightened around the microphone. "But I don't think I can pretend anymore." Backstage monitors showed producers exchanging confused glances. One quietly asked, "Should we cut this short?" Another shook his head. "Not yet," Seo-yeon continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "6 months ago, I was diagnosed with a serious illness." A collective silence swept through the studio. No dramatic music played, no camera zoomed aggressively. The only sound was the faint hum of the studio lights overhead. "The doctors have done everything they can," she said. "My family keeps telling me to stay hopeful, so I smile for them." She paused, looking down at the floor. "But the truth is, I stopped believing I had a future." Several audience members quietly wiped tears from their eyes. J-Hope lowered his gaze. Jungkook swallowed hard, unable to hide the emotion spreading across his face. Jin folded his hands together without speaking. RM watched intently, sensing this moment had become far bigger than television. Seo-yeon continued. "I wrote a letter." Her voice trembled again, "not because I wanted an autograph, but because I wanted someone to know I wasn't afraid anymore." She looked toward the usher standing near the aisle. "I already gave it away." Jimin's heart sank. The envelope, that's why she had let it go. Before anyone else could react, he quietly stood from his chair. The movement surprised the host, the audience, and even the production crew. Ignoring the cameras, he stepped down from the stage and slowly walked toward Seo-yeon. Security instinctively moved forward before receiving a quick signal to stand down. Jimin stopped only a few feet away. "May I ask you something?" he said softly. Seo-yeon nodded through tears. "If that letter was your goodbye." He hesitated, choosing every word with extraordinary care. "Why did you decide to hand it away instead of reading it yourself?" Seo-yeon looked at him for several seconds before answering. "Because I thought, if no one heard it, maybe it would hurt my family less." A silence deeper than anything earlier settled over the room. Jimin slowly shook his head. "Sometimes," he whispered, "people who love us don't need a perfect goodbye." His own voice had begun to tremble. "They need one more chance to keep fighting beside us." Suga had remained seated until that moment. Throughout the conversation, his eyes had never left Seo-yeon. Something in her words had awakened memories he had spent years quietly carrying. Long nights of exhaustion, moments of despair hidden behind work, and the unbearable weight of believing that silence protected the people you loved. Without a word, he stood as well. The audience instinctively shifted their attention toward him. Suga walked slowly until he stood beside Jimin. Neither of them looked at the cameras anymore. This was no longer a television segment, it had become a conversation between 3 human beings. Suga spoke quietly, almost as though he were speaking only to Seo-yeon. "When someone decides they're carrying too much alone," he said, "they often believe disappearing is kindness." He paused, his expression growing distant. "But loneliness is a terrible liar." Seo-yeon's tears flowed freely now. "I'm tired," she admitted. "I know," Suga replied. "You don't have to convince us." Then Jimin gently reached into his jacket pocket and removed a small silver guitar pick attached to a worn keyring, a keepsake he had carried for years. He placed it carefully into Seo-yeon's trembling hand. "Keep this," he said, "not because it belongs to me, but because from this moment on, I want it to remind you that your story isn't finished until you decide to write its final page surrounded by people who refuse to leave you." Seo-yeon stared at the small object, unable to speak. The audience was silent. Crew members behind the cameras had stopped working altogether. Even the host quietly lowered her cue cards. Then Jimin turned towards Suga. Their eyes met for only a brief second. Jimin took a slow breath and, forgetting entirely that millions of people were watching live, spoke the sentence that came straight from his heart. "Hyung," he said, his voice breaking with emotion, "all these years you've carried everyone else's pain. But today, please don't carry this one alone either." The words struck Suga like a wave he had never prepared to face. His breathing faltered, his lips parted, but no sound emerged. Every emotion he had buried behind calm smiles, relentless work, and quiet resilience seemed to surface all at once. The studio blurred before his eyes, his knees weakened. And within seconds, Suga collapsed to the floor, not because of Jimin's words alone, but because they finally gave him permission to stop pretending he had to be the strongest person in every room. The shocked silence that followed was unlike anything anyone present would ever forget. For one suspended heartbeat, the studio seemed to forget how to breathe. The applause signs above the audience continued flashing automatically, but no one looked at them. The control room, usually alive with overlapping instructions and countdowns, fell eerily silent. Every monitor displayed the same image, Jimin instinctively dropping to his knees beside Suga, one hand supporting his shoulder while the other reached for his wrist. "Hyung, can you hear me?" Jimin's voice was calm, but his eyes betrayed the fear he was fighting to contain. Medical personnel stationed backstage were already moving, yet Jimin never stepped away. Suga's eyes remained closed for only a few seconds before he slowly drew a shaky breath. He wasn't unconscious for long, but the emotional weight of the moment lingered over the room like heavy rainclouds refusing to move. "I'm okay," Suga whispered hoarsely, though the words carried little conviction. The doctor crouched beside him, checking his pulse and blood pressure while quietly asking routine questions. "Can you tell me your name?" A faint smile crossed Suga's lips despite everything. "If I forget that, we're in trouble." The gentle attempt at humor earned a few relieved laughs from nearby staff, but nobody mistook it for genuine recovery. The physician looked toward the producers. "He should rest for a while. Physically he appears stable, but emotionally he's overwhelmed." The live broadcast faded into an unscheduled commercial break, something the network almost never allowed. Cameras remained inside the studio, but the public no longer saw what happened next. As technicians lowered their equipment and audience members were politely asked to remain seated, Jimin helped Suga walk slowly toward a quiet dressing room tucked behind the main stage. No reporters followed, no cameras entered. For the first time that evening, the noise disappeared. The dressing room was modest. A single sofa rested against one wall. Warm yellow lights replaced the bright studio panels. Half-finished bottles of water stood beside a tray of untouched fruit prepared before the broadcast. Rain tapped softly against the narrow window overlooking the parking area. It was almost peaceful. Jimin closed the door behind them. Neither of them spoke immediately. Suga sat on the edge of the sofa, elbows resting on his knees, staring at the floor. Jimin remained standing for several seconds before quietly sitting beside him, leaving just enough space to respect the silence. Years earlier, either of them might have rushed to fill the quiet with reassuring words. Not anymore. They had learned that some silences deserved patience rather than interruption. After nearly a minute, Suga exhaled slowly. "I embarrassed everyone." Jimin immediately shook his head. "No, millions of people watched that. They watched someone be human." Suga let out a tired laugh that lasted only a moment. "Human." He repeated the word almost as if testing whether he still believed it applied to himself. "You know," he murmured, "I've written so many songs about surviving difficult nights." His eyes remained fixed on the floor. "Sometimes people assume that means I always know how to survive my own." Jimin listened without interrupting. Suga rubbed his hands together absent-mindedly, noticing they were still trembling. When she said she was tired, he continued quietly, "It felt familiar." He paused again. "Not because our lives are the same, but because I recognize that look, the one where someone smiles because they don't want anyone else to worry." Jimin lowered his head. "I recognized it too." Another silence settled between them, softer this time. Outside the room, faint footsteps echoed through the hallway before disappearing again. Somewhere in the distance, crew members prepared the stage, uncertain whether the broadcast would resume. Inside, time seemed to move more slowly. "Do you remember our trainee days?" Jimin suddenly asked. Suga smiled faintly without looking up. "Which part?" "The winter when the heater kept breaking." Suga chuckled quietly. "How could I forget? You stayed awake almost every night writing music. And you pretended to be asleep." Jimin finally smiled. "I wasn't pretending." Suga looked at him for the first time since entering the room. "You always knew when something was wrong." Jimin shrugged gently. "Not always. Enough." The word lingered between them. Suga leaned back against the sofa and closed his eyes briefly. "I spent years believing being dependable meant never letting anyone see me struggle." His voice softened almost to a whisper. "Today, when you said I didn't have to carry everything alone." He stopped before finishing the sentence. Jimin turned toward him. "I wasn't trying to expose you." "I know." Suga nodded slowly. "That's why it hurt." His eyes glistened under the warm light. "Because part of me realized I'd been hiding even from the people who would have stayed." Jimin looked down at his own hands before answering. "You once told me something after one of my difficult rehearsals." Suga frowned slightly, trying to remember. Jimin smiled. "You said strength isn't measured by how long you can stand, it's measured by whether you're willing to let someone catch you before you fall." Suga blinked in surprise. "I actually said that." "You did." sounds wiser than I usually am. They both laughed softly, the tension easing for the first time since the collapse. The laughter wasn't loud, but it was genuine. A gentle knock interrupted the moment. RM opened the door just enough to peek inside. Behind him stood Jin, J-Hope, Jungkook and Taehyung, all wearing the same mixture of concern and quiet relief. Can we come in? RM asked. Suga looked around at the familiar faces before nodding. Nobody rushed toward him. Nobody overwhelmed him with questions. Jin simply placed a cup of warm tea on the table without saying a word. J-Hope quietly adjusted the blanket draped over the sofa. Jungkook sat cross-legged on the floor, leaning against the wall as though they were back in an old practice room. Taehyung smiled gently before looking out at the rain through the window. RM finally broke the silence. The producers asked whether we want to continue the broadcast. Everyone looked towards Suga. He thought for a long moment before slowly shaking his head. Not tonight, no one objected. RM simply nodded. Then tonight ends here. For several seconds the 7 members remained together without speaking. No cameras recorded the room, no audience applauded, no scripts waited on cue cards. There were only 7 friends sharing the kind of silence earned through years of trust. Beyond the dressing room walls the world continued moving as always. Inside, however, something had quietly changed. Not because someone had collapsed on live television, but because, perhaps for the first time in a long while, none of them felt obligated to hide the weight they had been carrying from one another. And in that quiet room, while rain continued to fall outside, healing began not through grand speeches but through presence, honesty, and the simple decision to stay. The rain had stopped by the time the dressing room door opened again, but the silence that followed the members into the hallway felt heavier than the storm itself. The network executives had already agreed to suspend the remainder of the live broadcast, replacing it with a simple message explaining that the program would not continue due to an unexpected situation. Across social media, millions of viewers began sharing clips from the final moments before the interruption. Yet instead of speculation or outrage, an overwhelming wave of concern spread across ARMY. Hashtags asking people to respect the members' privacy quickly outnumbered those demanding explanations. Even journalists gathered outside the studio lowered their cameras when they realized no statement would be given that night. Inside the building, Han Seoyeon remained seated alone in a quiet waiting room. She had repeatedly asked the staff not to disturb the members. "Please tell them I'm all right," she insisted, though her swollen eyes revealed otherwise. The folded envelope she had surrendered earlier rested unopened on a nearby table. She stared at it as though it belonged to another version of herself. A gentle knock interrupted her thoughts. She looked up. Jimin stood at the doorway. Beside him was Suga. Neither of them wore stage microphones anymore. Neither looked like global superstars. They looked like 2 tired friends who had simply come to keep a promise. "I'm sorry," Seoyeon said immediately, standing so quickly that the chair nearly tipped over. "I never wanted any of this to happen." Suga shook his head. "You didn't do this. I shouldn't have spoken." "You told the truth," Jimin answered softly. "Truth isn't something people should apologize for." Her shoulders began trembling again. "I thought I ruined your evening." Suga slowly walked toward the small table where the envelope lay waiting. For several seconds he simply looked at it. Then he asked, "May I?" Seoyeon hesitated before quietly nodding. He picked up the envelope with extraordinary care, almost as though it were fragile enough to fall apart in his hands. "Not going to read it," he said. She looked confused. "Then why?" "Because this wasn't written for strangers." He gently placed it back into her hands. "It belongs to the people who still have time to tell you they love you." Those words shattered the final wall she had built around herself. She broke down completely, covering her face as years of hidden fear escaped in uncontrollable sobs. Not the quiet tears she had allowed herself inside hospital corridors, not the polite smile she had worn for her family. These were the tears of someone who no longer had the strength to pretend she was fine. Without hesitation, Jimin stepped closer. He didn't hug her immediately. Instead, he simply stood beside her until she chose to lean forward. Only then did he gently place one arm around her shoulders. No dramatic speeches followed, only silence. Sometimes compassion sounded exactly like that. After several minutes, Seoyeon finally whispered the words she had been unable to tell anyone. "I'm scared." Confession hung in the room like fragile glass. Suga answered first. "So am I." She looked up, surprised. He smiled faintly. "Different reasons." Another pause. "But fear doesn't mean you've already lost." Jimin nodded. "It means you're facing something important." Seoyeon wiped her tears. "I don't know how much time I have." Suga met her eyes steadily. "None of us do." The sentence wasn't cruel. It wasn't meant to erase her struggle. It simply reminded everyone in the room that life had never offered guarantees to anyone, only opportunities to choose how each day would be lived. At that moment, another quiet knock came from the hallway. RM entered first, followed by Jin, J-Hope, Jungkook, and Taehyung. Each carried something small. A notebook, a marker, an old Polaroid camera, a paper bag from the studio cafe. Nothing expensive, nothing ceremonial. Jin smiled warmly. "We were thinking." He placed the paper bag on the table. Nobody should cry on an empty stomach. Room filled with soft laughter. J-Hope unpacked warm bread and fruit. Jungkook handed Seoyeon a bottle of water. Taehyung quietly placed a tiny potted lavender plant beside the envelope. "I found it near the studio entrance," he admitted shyly. "It looked lonely." Seoyeon smiled through fresh tears. RM opened the notebook. About this, he looked around at the members. "Instead of signing autographs, let's each write one sentence, not as celebrities, as people. One by one, each member wrote a short handwritten message. Some were humorous, some deeply personal, some consisted of only a few words. No cameras captured them, no publisher would ever print them. When the notebook reached Suga, he stared at the blank page for a long time before writing carefully. He closed it without showing anyone. Finally it reached Jimin. He smiled gently and added the last sentence. Then RM handed the notebook to Seoyeon. You don't have to read it today. It whenever tomorrow feels impossible. Unable to speak, she nodded. Then almost instinctively she reached into her bag. She removed the goodbye letter without hesitation. She tore it in half, then again and again. The tiny pieces drifted into the nearby recycling bin like leaves carried away by a quiet breeze. Nobody applauded, nobody celebrated. Because everyone in the room understood something important. This wasn't the end of suffering. Her illness had not disappeared. Her future was still uncertain. Tomorrow would still include hospital visits, difficult conversations, exhausting treatments, and moments of fear. But one irreversible decision had changed. She was no longer preparing to say goodbye. She was preparing to keep living. Suga watched the torn pieces disappear before quietly closing his eyes. A single tear rolled down his cheek, not from sadness alone, from relief. Because the sentence Jimin had spoken on live television had not only reached Seoyeon, it had reached him as well. For years he had believed protecting others meant carrying every burden in silence. Tonight he finally understood another truth. Sometimes the greatest act of courage wasn't writing another song, or standing on another stage, or pretending to be strong. Sometimes courage meant allowing someone else to stand beside you while you found the strength to take the next step. Morning sunlight filtered through the hospital windows 2 days later, replacing the cold fluorescent glow that had accompanied so many sleepless nights. The city had already moved on to new headlines, but inside one quiet room on the 8th floor, time still seemed to move at its own gentle pace. Han Seoyeon sat beside the window with the notebook RM had given her resting on her lap. The lavender plant Taehyung had placed beside her now stood on the windowsill, its small purple blossoms leaning toward the light. She had not opened the notebook until that morning, when she finally did. Each handwritten message felt less like advice and more like a companion waiting patiently beside her. Jin had written, please eat well whenever you can. A warm meal cannot solve everything, but it reminds your heart that tomorrow deserves another chance. J-Hope's page read, hope is not something you wait to feel. Sometimes you choose it first and your heart catches up later. Jungkook had simply written, keep making memories. Even small ones become reasons to smile someday. Taehyung's message was only one sentence. Some flowers bloom quietly, but that never makes them less beautiful. Had filled barely half a page. Life rarely asks whether we are ready before changing our direction. The only question that matters is whether we continue walking together. Then came Suga's page. She paused. His handwriting was neat but noticeably slower than the others. If one day you feel like disappearing into silence, promise yourself one thing. Let someone hear your voice first. Silence should never have the final answer. By the time she reached Jimin's final page, her vision had blurred with tears. The strongest people I've ever met weren't the ones who never cried. They were the ones who kept choosing tomorrow even after believing tomorrow no longer wanted them. She gently closed the notebook against her chest. For the first time since receiving her diagnosis, she asked her doctor a question she had never wanted answered before. What are my treatment options now? The doctor smiled with quiet relief. Been hopping, you would ask. Across Seoul, the members of BTS had returned to their individual schedules, but something subtle had changed among them. During rehearsals, they checked on one another more often. Long hours in recording studios no longer ended with silent goodbyes. Instead, someone would inevitably ask, have you eaten? Or do you want to talk before you go home? Small questions, almost insignificant to outsiders, gradually became part of their routine. No one announced these changes publicly. They simply became habits born from one unforgettable evening. Suga found himself spending more time in his studio than ever, but his approach to songwriting shifted. Instead of burying unfinished emotions beneath endless revisions, he began writing honestly from the beginning. One afternoon, a young producer nervously apologized for making a mistake during a recording session. In the past, Suga might have quietly corrected it and continued working. This time he smiled gently, allowed to have difficult days. The producer looked surprised. So are you? The words lingered long after the session ended. Jimin also found himself thinking frequently about the waiting room conversation. Whenever interviews drifted toward questions about success or fame, he answered with unusual simplicity. Moments people never see, he once said softly, are usually the ones that change you the most. Viewers assumed he was speaking generally. Only 6 other people fully understood what he meant. Several weeks later, Seoyeon began treatment with renewed determination. There were still painful days when exhaustion stole her appetite and fear returned without warning. On those mornings, she would place the notebook beside her hospital bed and read a different page before each appointment. Nurses soon noticed the little lavender plant had become a symbol on the ward. Other patients began bringing small plants of their own, placing them near windows as quiet reminders that growth often continued long before anyone noticed it. One afternoon, a young child receiving treatment wandered into Seoyeon's room carrying a sketchbook. Can I draw your flower? He asked shyly. She smiled, only if I can see the finished picture. drawing wasn't perfect. The stem leaned sideways, the petals were uneven, but beneath the flower the child carefully wrote, "Still growing." Seo-yeon asked if she could keep it. He nodded proudly. Months passed. The televised moment itself slowly disappeared from public discussion. Clips were respectfully removed by many fan communities after requests to protect the members' privacy. Instead of replaying Suga's collapse, fans began sharing stories of kindness inspired by that evening. Blood donation drives quietly appeared under fan-organized projects. Hospital libraries received new books funded by ARMY around the world. Volunteers visited patients spending long periods away from home. None of these efforts claimed to imitate BTS directly. Rather, they reflected the message that compassion often began with simply noticing the person everyone else overlooked. Even the television crew carried the experience with them. The stage manager, who had almost cut Seo-yeon's microphone short later, revised the production guidelines for future programs, encouraging staff to prioritize humanity over perfect schedules whenever circumstances safely allowed. One camera operator admitted that, despite years covering live broadcasts, he had never understood how quickly ordinary conversations could become life-changing moments. The unopened cue cards from that interrupted evening remained stored inside the network archives. No one ever used them again, not because they had become valuable television memorabilia, but because everyone involved understood that the most meaningful part of the broadcast had never been written on those pages. It had happened in the unscripted space between strangers who chose to listen. And although no one present could erase the fear, uncertainty, or pain that still existed, they had proven something quietly extraordinary. One honest conversation offered with patience instead of judgment had changed the direction of multiple lives, not by creating a miracle, but by reminding each person that carrying life's heaviest burdens was never meant to be a solitary journey.